Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Racism in the Foster Care System. Where do we go from here? I'm Allison Gilbreth. I'm with Voices for Virginia's Children, and joining us today is Fallon Speaker. She is the director of the Family Law Clinic at University of Richmond. She is going to be an excellent contributor today, and we have a lot to say. Also with us is Valerie LaRue. She is the Virginia Poverty Law Center Director of Family Law, and also has a lot to say. I'm the only non-attorney here, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Before I get started, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Of course, this is a Facebook Live, and the way that Facebook Lives work best are when you are engaged with us. So we want you to do a couple of things. The first thing we want you to do is click like on this video. That is going to help this video get into other streams and for as many people to see it as possible. If you're really liking what you hear, click the share button or even start a watch party on your own Facebook account. That's really going to help us to share this message. And the third thing we want you to do is to go ahead and put some comments into the comment box. Tell us where you are from, where you're watching from. We know that we have some folks from all over Virginia listening in today, and also some other states. I think there are some folks listening in from Vermont and Georgia. So we're just so grateful that everybody is here to listen in today. Of course, this is part of Race and Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. I'm thankful to my colleague, Chloe Edwards, who was the brainchild behind this idea, and we are excited to have this program today to talk to you about what racism in the foster care is. A couple of things, again, before we get started. We're trying our best with technology, so bear with us. If we have any issues with our connectivity, we're gonna get through it and know that we will figure it out, so don't worry. We're gonna make sure we get as much content to you as possible in a short amount of time. Of course, put your questions, your thoughts. I know I respond well when people are engaged. It's harder for me to do that virtually. So if you're really feeling what we're saying, if you could do some snaps in the comments, you can say, yes, I get yes. We want to see that so that we know we're connecting with you. If you don't agree with what we're saying, you can put comments in the comment section so that we can walk through them. But what we really want is for you to come into this with an open mind. We know that in order for us to do some talking today, it requires having an open mind, that maybe you came here today with some preconceived notions of what you think the foster care system is like, and maybe you hear some things from us that you hadn't really considered before, or maybe you don't agree with. But we hope that you would come with an open mind, that maybe some things your mind will change today. Maybe some things you're seeing and hearing, it will affirm that it's not just you who thinks those things, but lots of other people. And we hope that we will give you some guidance today to talk about next steps. So with that, and with lots of comments going in the comment section, so please continue to put those. Let us know where you're from and let us know that you're here, and keep liking and sharing this video. I'm going to get us started because we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I want to open this up to my awesome panelists here, and we're going to talk about, let's get into it, y'all. Let's talk about the child welfare system and how we got here, and whether you believe that the foster care system has tenets of racism within it. And I think Fallon is ready to start for us.
Yes, thanks, Allison. So I want to start us off with a quote from one of my favorite scholars, and who is truly taking the context of the child welfare system and making it mainstream, and has really helped develop my own work and practice. Dorothy Roberts, she stated, if an outsider looked at the American child welfare system, she would likely conclude that this is not a system designed to promote the welfare of America's children. Rather, it is a system designed to regulate, monitor, and punish poor families, especially poor Black families. The fact that the system supposedly designed to protect children remains one of the most segregated institutions in the country should arouse suspicion. And I think we should hold on to that sort of quote for a moment here. And I want to give some context from my opinion, my research on sort of the history of the child welfare system and the foster care system and the history of racism within that system. And I think it really begins with us going back to the days of chattel slavery. The separation of Black and brown children began during that period. It was a time in which Black and brown mothers and fathers were not allowed to have control over their children. They weren't allowed the fundamental right to parent their children as were white parents or wealthy parents. And they had to watch their children be stripped from them, oftentimes by slave auctioneers. And you can liken that to very much the same sort of police and CPS reform efforts that are used to remove children today, right, from parents against their will. And so we saw that happened in chattel slavery. And then after the institution of slavery was so-called ended in the United States, and we moved into a period in which Black people and brown people were seen to become citizens. They still, we understand, did not enjoy many of the same rights as the dominant culture of white people did, right? And they still were very restricted. Many of those restrictions came in the form of Jim Crow laws and other post-Reconstructed era laws. But one of the major things that we saw rise over time was how the country and the state decided to parent Black and brown parents and low-income parents in terms of how they were raising their children. This was in terms of what schools they could send their children to, what programs they qualified for housing, what programs they qualified for medical, educational, the communities that they could live in, their segregated communities. And then we saw when we moved into the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, we saw an increase in sort of the welfare era of social work, right? And in that era of social work, what we saw was that the state provided benefits to Black and brown communities and low-income communities, but used those benefits as a tool to survey those families. In essence, saying, you know, if you want to receive benefits, you're going to have to comply with the program and restrictions that we place on you and your family. And this opened the door for many of these welfare institutions to come into these communities and to create a large system of surveillance, that paralleled the mass incarceration rate that took place during the war on drugs at the same period, right? And so I like to look at it as a parallel in terms of mass incarceration as well as mass welfare and child welfare involvement in Black and brown communities. Because at the same time that we were locking up Black and brown men for drug use and high crime rates, and we were, you know, funneling money into these communities for police efforts to raid these homes, we were doing the same thing to Black and brown mothers and families. And so this is when we saw the first spike in removals of Black and brown children from their homes. We deemed these parents crack parents, and we deemed these babies crack babies, and we used that as a logic to continue the destruction and the breakdown of the Black family unit, right? And so over a period of time, you see generations of children and families going through this cycle of involvement with the child welfare system. And this is how you get generational foster youth foster parents, or children who've been involved in the system who then become parents who are involved in the system, right? And Dorothy Roberts talks about this in her book, Shattering Bonds. And so I think this is a really important point to talk about. That history is something that has sort of stayed with us as a nation, right, in terms of how we treat sort of poor people and Black and brown people in general. And while the ante amped up in the 70s and the 80s, it was in the 90s that the crime bill was passed, right? And it was in the 90s that the ASFA, Adoption and Safe Families Act, I believe it was passed in 1997, which is sort of, like I said, it parallels the crime bill, because essentially what we were saying is that we don't have time to wait for these parents to get their acts together, right? We need to speed up the process for which we are allowing children to become free for adoption. And what we know now, right, in hindsight, is that is not what happened, right? Children didn't all of a sudden become free for permanent placements. Many lingered in foster care, continue to linger in foster care today. What we saw was a rise in the number of broken adoptions, young children, typically between the ages of 0 and 5, who were really quickly, their parents' rights were terminated really quickly, tend to be a part of a broken adoption when they become teenagers, right? And then have to linger in foster care and then go back through that pipeline, right? And so what we saw created was foster care to prison pipeline, foster care to child welfare pipeline. And that was largely in part due to this increased time frame in which we wanted to terminate families' rights. And then what we see also is a lot of these teenage children who are left in foster care, who want to now have a relationship with their parents, finding it really hard to be able to do so because that unit has been broken up. And so one of the things that is on a lot of people's mind at this point, I think, is like, how do we fix this? How do we fix these broken families and broken communities? And a part of that is really, I think, what we're going to get into later on in the conversation. But this is sort of, we got to understand how we got here, how we broke up these families, how we broke up these communities over a period of time, and the sort of oversight and policing that we use to continue to do that. And, you know, the use of funneling resources into that surveillance and policing, as opposed to funneling those resources into the improvement of the communities and families that we're seeking to serve.
Totally. I'm sure for a lot of you listening, that was a lot of information, a lot of content. Put your thoughts and how you're, did you know all of those things? And I know, Valerie, you had a take on that question as well.
Yeah, so, another thing, the way to look at it is, might be called sort of the white do-gooder syndrome.
About that.
We have a belief that the sort of 1950s style white middle class lifestyle is the perfect lifestyle in which to raise children. And so if a child isn't being raised in that situation, it doesn't really matter how loving or caring or safe the parent is. What matters is that the child needs to grow up in this 1950s style white middle class family, because that's going to be in the child's best interest. And that ignores all the things, maybe back in the 1950s, we didn't understand attachment, and we didn't understand how harmful it is to children to break that primary attachment. But now we do understand that. And the fact that we're still acting in those ways and causing that kind of harm to children, I'm going to pull out my statistics hat because I'm one of the statistics people. There was a study that was done in 2007 where they looked at children in foster care who were what's called on the margins of removal. And that means a child who, nothing really horribly horrific is going on, and this is something that I need to stress over and over again, 80% of children who are removed from their homes are not removed because something horrific is going on. Usually it's just it's what's called neglect, and neglect can be a lot of different things, including just not living that 1950s white middle class lifestyle. But children who are at the margins, where there might be a decision being made about removing a child from their home, their family, and some of those children might be removed and other children might be left at home. When they looked at those children back in 2007, 15,000 children that they tracked between 1990 and 2002, They found that the children who were removed had worse outcomes than the children who remained at home. And to go back to Fallon's point about the foster care or child welfare to prison pipeline, a quarter of all people in prisons were in foster care. So it is a very strong pipeline, and it's a very dangerous pipeline because we're basically taking these children from homes and families that may be very functional and just need some assistance, and turning them into lifelong wards of the state. And as Fallon said, a lot of these children, we have this idea that these children are going to be adopted. Virginia is a good example that huge numbers of children are never adopted from foster care, but age out of foster care into a society that where they don't have a family, they don't have a support system. As Fallon said, most of them do try to reconnect with their families as soon as they're old enough to do so, but a lot of times those bonds are broken and it's really hard for them to do that.
What you both touched on between taking it, I know some of you are just joining our Facebook Live, and we've been talking about like, how did we get here? How is the foster care system has racism permeating in the system? And you've talked about going all the way back to slavery. Valerie, you were talking about this concept of what is a good family. We can even look at policies that are in direct response to our concept of what makes a good family. When we think about the timeline of termination of parental rights, it really often doesn't give families the opportunity to quote unquote get themselves together, even if they were doing all of the right things, or if they make one tiny little mistake, they're just taken all the way back, and all of the work that they had done to get their children back is really for naught. But we also are, the way we go about recruiting foster families, it's still caught up in that 1950s model of what is a good family. At Voices, we have the Kids Count Data Center, and our data center shows that Black children, particularly in Virginia, are overrepresented in our child welfare system. Black kids make up about 20% of the child population, but about 30% of the population in child welfare. And it's even greater when you look at older youth, and even greater when you look at the youth that are aging out of foster care that you were talking about, Valerie. All of this is just so concerning. And I know for some of you who are watching who have been in this sector for a long time, this may not be a shock to you at all. Some of you, maybe it is. I do think that one of the things that's important as we talk about the history of this is, do foster parents know this going in to this? When they become foster parents, do they know the history of racism in foster care? Are they aware of the trauma that has occurred within that child's life to be removed, and often removed to a family who doesn't share the same culture as them, and all of the beliefs that they may have, but also when they were loved by their parents. They might have been living in circumstances that maybe not every single person thinks is ideal, but they were loved. And I think that is the challenging part for a lot of people who work in child welfare, is missing that part, not seeing the trauma that is happening to children. But I know we have a lot of other great questions to get to, so I'm going to move us on to the next one that might be, a little bit challenging to answer, and I'm curious for folks who are watching what their thoughts are. So we're, as a nation, we're at one of the greatest civil rights movements of our lifetime, without a doubt. We've seen young people in the streets marching, having their voices heard. A lot of the conversation is really around the criminal justice system, but Fallon, as you touched on, the criminal justice system and child welfare system are very much aligned in the ways that they're serving similar populations. So this question is about, while we're having this national conversation around reinvest, providing services, what does that look like for child welfare? Mm-hmm. And Fallon, if you want to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's okay for me to just touch on one thing. And I think it's
conversational. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a concept of like what family disintegration is. And it's a phrase that I sort of coined from Dorothy Roberts. But one of the things that stood out to me when you were just speaking, Allison, when you were talking about, I wonder if foster parents really know, like what they're getting themselves into, like what the system is like. But I think if we even take a step back, why so many children have to go into foster care, right? It's because the system deems the family members who come forward to care for these kids, right, while this case is happening, to not be appropriate caregivers. And we have to talk about some of the reasons for why that is. And a lot of those reasons are because many of those caregivers, those family members who are now ready to take on this addition and support in their other family member, have cases that have been called against them. They themselves have a history of child welfare and neglect. And the reason why that is important in understanding it through a racial and racial lens, and one looking at it through the lens of racism, right, is that the reasons for why they might have some child welfare history. And largely that is because of issues, as Valerie has indicated, which is of poverty and neglect, right? It's not the sort of thing that we see on TV, which is like missing children, dead children, like, that sort of thing. It's like issues of not having adequate housing and clothing and food and shelter, right? And like, who is to say that over generations those issues haven't been remedied? But what we're saying is that those issues then make those family members not eligible to become caretakers for these children, which is why they then have to go into the foster care system. And the foster parents who are taking on these kids, many times, and I practice in 3 jurisdictions now, and in each of those jurisdictions I ran into foster parents who told me, like, I got into this because I thought I would be able to, like, get this kid really easily, right? Like, I thought I would be able to adopt. I didn't know I was going to have to work with this family. I didn't know I was going to have to, like, work with this mother or this father to, they could possibly have their child back. And so I think a part of it is also reimagining sort of like what the role of the foster parent is, and like how do we build a bridge between those people who are coming forward as sources of support for children and families who are involved in the child welfare system. Now, that being said, your question was specifically about sort of what those resources could look like. How can we imagine those resources in the child welfare system? And I think largely it requires us to think about what do families need? And I just spoke about the issues of poverty and neglect. And, many times when overwhelmingly, I would say 90% of the cases I've dealt with, and of the hundreds of cases in the child welfare system, are cases of poverty and neglect. If those parents and those families were given daycare, if they were given a nanny, right? If they were given adequate driving, a car, right? Or adequate transportation if they were in a city, right? If they had adequate food subsidy and, like, the ability to provide for their family financially, they would be okay. The services that are the issues that bring them into the light of the system are issues of poverty. And the way in which we can resolve that is to resolve the issues of poverty on a larger level, right? Provide good housing, clean housing for people, right? Safe neighborhoods, that sort of thing, and provide access to it. Now, a large part of it is about access and the ability to gain these resources without having to also jump through a million other hoops, right? And like I talked about, the historical context of welfare is that if you want this, you'll do what we say, which oftentimes can mean going through 5 different hoops. If you miss an appointment, all of a sudden your insurance is cut off. If you miss an appointment, all of a sudden you have to move out of your apartment, right? That sort of thing. And so, like, fixing those systemic barriers to moving forward and out of poverty, I think that's a part of it. And it's especially, and some people say, well, how can we do that, right? Like, so many people are in the system, how can we possibly do that? But we absolutely can do that, because when we remove children, we're funding the foster care system, right, to then take care of those children. And so a part of it is like thinking about all of the money that we're spending and investing in the foster care system and reinvesting that money into communities to provide preventative supports for families and children so that they do not need to become entangled in the child welfare system in the first place.
Totally. And I think a lot of child welfare workers who are watching, if you are a worker, please let us know in the comments. These are things that they know that they want to do for their families and have not been able to do. And there's been some policy passed to invest in it, but really nowhere near what we all think really needs to happen. Valerie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the things I think we need to look at too is what kind of help is offered. One of the things that we see is if a family, for instance, if there's domestic violence in the family, a lot of times that's held against the parent who is not committing the violence. Um, and, those kinds of things where we hold people sort of to a special standard in order to give them help. We don't want to give them help unless they do the things that we say and live their life the way we want them to. And, we've seen that, like when Native American children were removed from their families and sent to live in boarding schools, it was believed that, those children will be better off because they're learning English and they will assimilate into American culture better. Recognizing that people can have perfectly functional cultures that are completely different from ours and have different beliefs about how children, should be taken care of. And one of those things might be like in Scandinavian countries where, mothers go to the coffee shop and they go inside and have coffee with a friend. They leave the child outside in the stroller in, sub-zero weather. If you did that here in the US, you better believe your child will end up in foster care.
For sure.
Scandinavian countries, that's believed to be the healthiest thing you can do for your child, to have them get nice, fresh, cold air. And in fact, at daycare centers, the children are put outside to take their naps. But here we don't do that. And the same thing happens, in terms of the drug use. We actually had a big change this year in Virginia where you no longer will be prevented from getting SNAP if you have a drug felony on your record, but for many years.
Food assistance for folks who aren't familiar.
Sorry, SNAP is the acronym for food stamps. For many years, children were harmed because their parents weren't able to access this kind of food assistance for their children. So these value judgments that we make about families, which, to go back to Fallon's point, we make about poor families and families of color. Wealthy families have often, going back to the crack baby, epidemic, there has never been a showing that children who were exposed to crack in the womb have worse outcomes than children who were not. Whereas children who are exposed to alcohol in the womb often do have worse outcomes. Wealthy women who might be alcoholics or taking prescription pills, they were not surveilled in the way lower income and families of color were surveilled. They are not tested when they come into the hospital to see if they have drugs in their system. These are things that we do specifically when families are lower income or of color that we do not do to other families. And to go back to Fallon's point about things that families need, we've seen families where, a mom goes in to have a job interview and she has no childcare. While she's in the interview, her kids stay in the car. Somebody sees the kids in the car and calls, the police or social services. So if a mom is poor and doesn't have money and can't pay someone to take care of her child, we are penalizing her for trying to get a job so that she will have money so that she can take care of her children. We're putting people in a catch-22 where they have to make a kind of choice of how do they care for their child? Do they allow their child to be homeless and starve because they can't afford to pay for food and housing? Or do we require them to be with them every single second, which prevents them from being able to get a job to provide those things? So we're creating these situations where families have a horrible choice to make because they don't have resources, and then we punish them for choosing whichever one of those two terrible choices we basically are offering them.
I think.
Can I add one follow-up to that really quick, Allison? I talked mostly about issues of poverty and neglect, but there are other issues that could come up with regards to abuse and neglect, right? And two of the things that come up to me oftentimes are substance use and abuse and mental health, right? And so when we're talking about resources, the lack of resources that we have to assist parents who are substance addicted or to assist parents who are undergoing mental health treatment with being able to continue their treatment in either mental health or substance abuse, and then also be able to care for their children at the same time is frightening. That lack of resources that we have dedicated and specifically provided for that. The way in which a child welfare system tends to plan with parents who use substances or who have any sort of mental illness is to say, until you can treat yourself, you cannot have your child. We are going to remove your child. And
studies, one of their most motivating factors in most cases.
Right. And studies have shown that's harmful. That's really, really harmful to children. That's really harmful to families. And what we need to do is invest in communities to provide support systems. There are so many different mother-child, father-child, family unit sort of situations that would allow for, and it's starting to pop up across the United States, but to sort of create support systems that are not social service systems, but are actual true support systems for these families so that they can, one, balance their mental health with also raising a child, right? And balance their substance use with being able to raise a child. And, not us thinking it's a zero tolerance system, right? Having a mental illness doesn't make you a bad parent, and using substances doesn't make you a bad parent. And I think we have to get to a place where we're okay with that.
That is exactly what I was getting ready to say. I'm sure for a lot of you watching, these are hard things to really digest. It can be challenging to say, no, how can we ever trust a parent who has a substance use disorder to raise a child? I think things that are important to point out in this conversation, one of the reasons we're talking about racism in the foster care system is because we're talking about how different populations of people based on race are treated differently for the same issues. We know that there are a lot of white families who have parental substance use disorder whose children aren't removed from their home. The difference is how we respond often to Black and brown families who are dealing with the same exact issues. In fact, what Fallon was talking about, I totally agree with. I think it's about how do we support those families? How do we support children in those situations so that it's not, right now the response is fear. If you are a parent in Virginia who has a substance use disorder and you know that you need help, you may not be willing to get help because you don't have a loved one who would be willing to take your child while you get that help. So instead, you just continue in this spiral because, like you said, Valerie, we put families in this catch-22 situation where it's either I get help or I lose my child. There isn't a way to see the whole person, the whole family. But I want to take it a step back too and talk about the workforce of the child welfare system. And again, I know that some of you might just be joining us and we're having a really thoughtful conversation on racism in the child welfare system and how we got here, where we're going. We've been talking about slavery all the way to policies that have been put in place recently, but we're about to talk about the workforce. When we look at the child welfare workforce, it is predominantly white. But even when we look at nonprofit organizations who serve children who are in foster care, their staffs are also largely white. And so the question that I have for all of us is, how does that play a role in what we're currently seeing in our system? And, what tools do you think workers need who are watching this? And whoever wants to start can jump in.
Well, one of the things that I think that we're starting to understand now, and Allison, you're exactly right, this is a very powerful moment for us all to start examining our own belief system, the lenses through which we look at things. One of the things that I think that a lot of people are not really aware of, but maybe are starting to learn, are what's known as implicit biases. So, it's one thing when we think about someone who is, an out and out racist or a bigot who can, easily articulate, I don't like, people who are, Black or something else because that's the case. But it's harder for a lot of people to understand that because racism is endemic in our culture, that it actually lives within all of us. And that includes, and when I say all of us, I mean all of us. So we have internalized these biases, these prejudices against certain people. And we don't even know that they reside inside our heads. And so it doesn't even matter if we're a white person or if we're a person of color, we have them inside our heads, we've internalized them. And if you're a white person, you have the belief that you are also better just because you've been told that your whole life. And you may not go around saying, oh, I'm better because I'm white, but nonetheless, you have an expectation of certain things just because you're white. And those implicit biases that live inside us affect the decisions we make when it comes to other people. It means that we see someone who is different from us and we immediately, even if we're not conscious of it, have a different attitude towards them and view them slightly differently and judge them differently because of that attitude that we hold. So getting to those implicit biases, it can be very difficult. There's a great website, and I'm sure somebody can throw it up in the chat. Harvard did a bunch of implicit bias tests that you can actually take yourself. And a lot of people, I think, are shocked when they take these tests to learn that, yes, they actually hold these biases.
Right.
Yes, you can change them, but you have to do so consciously and all the time because you're fighting against a culture that is telling you that things should be a certain way. And so you have to fight against that all the time. And when it comes to child welfare, then we're talking about, white child welfare workers and Black welfare workers who are looking at families of color and making decisions about them based on beliefs that live inside their heads that they're not fully aware of. And that harms children of color and families of color every day.
And Valerie, that makes me think of a very specific example. So for those of you who don't know, I work at Voices for Virginia's Children, but prior to that, I also was a court-appointed special advocate as a volunteer, and I worked in Richmond City courts. And I've seen lots and lots of child welfare court cases, both at my time there and my time at Voices. And I remember when I was a younger person, I think I was probably like 22 or something like that. And I walked into a courtroom to be there for one of the kids that were on my caseloads. A Black person who was an attorney, we call them GALs in Virginia, guardian ad litems, came up to me and said, "Oh, are you the neighborhood snitch?" And I was like, "Excuse me?" And so there's so much packed into that term, right, of neighborhood snitch. But there's also so much packed into the fact that we can have internalized racism, right? Like you can be a person of color working in child welfare, working in the courts, and you have taken on also the definition of good family or what it means to be in this workforce, taking those beliefs on, and then you're projecting them onto everyone, even if they're people of color or whatever. So I just wanted to point that out to say this isn't just issues that for people who are white and work in the workforce or maybe watching this, it also you can also experience these racist things from people of color towards other people of color. Right? We force ourselves to fit into these models that are often based in white supremacy to make ourselves feel like we belong in these environments. And Fallon, it looked like you were itching to say something.
Oh yeah, I was actually like just tapping my head, but I also wanted to say something. So I love this topic a lot because I think it forces those people like ourselves who are advocates in this system to reflect on how we are also perpetuating racism, right? And I say we because we all do it, right? And we have to get to a place where we're saying that we are no longer comfortable practicing in our racist system and that we actually want this system to be anti-racist. But in order to do that, we have to reflect on our own actions and our own involvement in that system. And I was just going to say, I will give an example for when I was in the Bronx. When I was practicing in New York City at the Bronx Defenders, I had hundreds of clients. I maybe recall having 2 or 3 white clients, right? And this isn't going to be the same geography everywhere in the United States, right? Because poverty is going to play a big part, especially when you get in rural areas. Virginia has some examples of that, right? But for each of those clients, it was so hard for the courts or for the department to want to remove their kids, right? Like we sort of had a running really bad joke that like they must have been like did the most awful thing ever several times over before anyone considered that step, right? In relation to some of our Black clients, you know, we talk about sort of implicit bias and how that can trigger you know, DSS's involvement in the way in which they target and disproportionately target Black and brown communities, right? But in many places, the DSS workers are overwhelmingly Black and brown themselves. And this gets to your point, Allison, about sort of internalized racism. Well, what they're internalizing is the system's racism, right? They're being taught how to police these families. They're being taught that, you know, these families do these things and that's not okay. And they start to align themselves with this thought process of, you know, I can go into your home and I can contradict you and I can be very patriarchal towards you and tell you what to do because I'm very different from you, right? Like, you know, like I am a good parent. I am a good mom. I am a good dad. You know, I have a good family. You do not know what you're doing, right? And we sort of use that power and privilege at every place when it comes into going into court, right? I've never been in a court system where the judge has not taken DSS's word verbatim, right? It doesn't really matter what our clients have to say because they don't have that power and that privilege. Despite whatever the race is between the two parties, they lack that power and privilege, right? And so I think, and then it also goes into sort of whoever the attorney is representing the department. It goes for the CASA, it goes for the GAL. All of these people have a power and a privilege, really, no matter what race they are, based on their role in the system. And our clients who stand before them, you know, oftentimes parents, and even times when we're talking about children, right? We have a lot of teenage children clients. They don't carry the same power and privilege, and their voice is very meaningless. And I think we have to reflect on that as advocates, especially when we go into these cases when we try to be persuasive in a way that's against the family, that really minimizes what voice they do, what little voice they do have, really minimizes that and changes that. And I think that until we can start to understand how we each play a role, you know, when I gave an example, Allison, of you being a CASA, right? When I was in New York, oftentimes, and even here in Virginia too, when I go into court, oftentimes the court officers or the sheriffs speak to me as if I'm a client. So they direct me around the courtroom as if I'm a client. Go sit here, go do this, go do that. And when I say to them, no, I'm an attorney, I'm always questioned again. And it never happens when I'm with my white colleagues, right? Yeah. You know, I've had judges question me in the same way. I've had other attorneys question me in the same way. You know, wanting my credentials to see that I am licensed to be able to do this. And so you have to imagine if they would do that to someone, and not to say that, you know, I'm above any of that, because I absolutely am not. But you have to imagine if they would do that to someone who has the same verbiage, that uses the same verbiage that they has the same sort of power and placement in the courtroom that they have, right? What they do and how they treat the people who are before them, right? Wow. The clients, the families that are before them. And so I really think that, you know, this is going to move us into another part of the conversation, but really reflecting on how we perpetuate racism on a daily basis, no matter what race we are. And specifically, I think the reason why it becomes problematic when you have an overarching, I think this is one of your initial points, Allison, when you have an overarching number of predominantly white people in this system that affects a disproportionate number of Black and brown people, I think it becomes a big issue, not only in this sort of practical arena of like working on the case, but thinking about how the policy is created, right? And like when you don't have people who are coming from these communities, who are living in these communities, you know, being a part of the conversation to develop policy, being a part of the case in court, then what you find is that you have an outside perspective that is very different from the cultural norm in those communities. And so I think that creates a lot of harm when we're talking about policy creation for child welfare.
Valerie, you look itching too.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow along with something you said, Allison, and this goes along with what you were saying, Fallon, and that is that when, you know, we sort of make this assumption that, well, you know, if there are people of color who are working in the system, then that is going to protect our families because, you know, they're not going to be racist. But the problem is, like, that puts those workers into a bind, because then they have to figure out, do I identify with this Black poor family, or do I identify with this white racist system? I'm working in the system. I do not want my, white coworkers looking at me and saying, oh, her family must be like this poor Black family because she's sticking up for them. So instead, I have to otherize this poor family so that I can be seen as a member of this privileged group. So we're putting those workers in a bind, and this can be again an unconscious bind. They're not saying, oh, I have to push that family away and make a decision to remove their child because otherwise everyone's going to think that I somehow support what they're doing. But that's essentially what we're doing. We're basically saying you have to align yourself with this racist system because otherwise we're going to align you with the family that you are investigating here. So we're putting people in that kind of bind, and we're also making them have to prove themselves. If here's an attorney, an attorney who is the director of a legal clinic, who is having to prove herself that yes, she is an attorney, that yes, she is an expert, yes, she's a powerful person. If you aren't as powerful as Fallon is, you have to prove yourself every day, every hour, every minute of the time. And so how do you prove yourself? I am not like them. And so you perpetuate that system just by the fact that you're in it, not because you want to, but because you have to.
So I'm gonna say one thing. I also want to say, if you're watching this live, if you haven't already, please like and share this video so it reaches as many people as possible. We want to hear your comments and questions. And if you have a question for us, please put that in the comment box. We may not be able to get to all of your questions right away, but the three of us are going to go in and try to respond to comments as they're popping up and as other people are talking. But I also wanted to add one more thing to our last conversation, and it's for folks who are working in the nonprofit sector where we're trying to serve children and families that are in child welfare. And sometimes we can other ourselves from those who might work directly for the state or directly for localities, but we have to have these same conversations within ourselves. If your organization is 50 years old, you have to have a critical conversation internally in your organization and say, why wasn't our number one issue eradicating racism at the height of when that was happening in our country? Why were we just focused on adoption or whatever the case may be? Like, ask yourselves those questions, talk about that journey that your organization has taken to get to where you are now. That way you can reflect and make sure, are we an anti-racist organization, or are we just continuing to perpetuate? Is our organization reliant upon children being removed in order to serve them, and therefore we are a part of why Black children continue to be funneled into the system? So I want to stop that question there because we have about 15 minutes left, and I really want to get into, okay, how do we reimagine child welfare? Is it possible to put things into our current system to make it anti-racist, or do we need to talk about transformation? And whoever wants to start, I know that's a lot of one question, but I want folks listening to hear.
All right, I'll start. But I think we have to first answer the question about what it means to be anti-racist, right? And from my perspective, that means taking action items to, go against the racist structures that are in place right now. It's not enough to just be comfortable in how you move individually. You have to really want to seek and actively dismantle any institutional racism. You have to critique yourself. You have to continuously critique yourself openly, right? But then also critique those around you. And to fight against any sort of racist notions. And so I think there's a lot that goes into anti-racism, which is not just, I don't do racist things, right? And so once we move past that level, then it's like, well, can we dismantle a system that does racist things, right? And because we have to acknowledge that the child welfare system does racist things, right? Maybe not each individual player of it, but the system in and of itself does. And the numbers do not lie about that, right? The disproportionate targeting and surveillance of Black and brown communities is something that is very real. And so can we, how can we fix that system? And personally, I don't believe you can fix a system that's rooted in slavery. That's rooted in the notions of, there being a difference in how you are able to raise and parent and to live your life, and to take care of your family based on your race, based on your class, right? I think that system requires then for you to have a notion that services are needed, right? That people need to be reformed, that families need to be reformed, they need to be fixed, as opposed to understanding sort of if there are any issues and cultural differences and norms that could be very different from yours, right? And appreciating what those cultural differences and norms in parenting and providing for your family can be, what they can be, and really allowing those families to thrive in the way that is culturally different for them, so long as it's a safe environment for those children, right? And a safe environment for their family. And so I don't think that based in the system that we have right now that is grounded and rooted and that long system that I talked about, for the past 400 years and how it has moved forward, I don't really think we can reform that system, right? I think the best way to, really challenge many of the racist stereotypes and harms that have been perpetuated by the child welfare system and foster care system as it exists today is to really reimagine what community support looks like for families. And I don't think that we can do that without having families at the table, right? That means that some of us in institutional places are going to have to remove ourselves from the conversation to make room for other people, those voices who we've kind of said, your voices don't matter. We can tell you how to parent. We can tell you how to raise your family. We can tell you how to build a community, right? Allowing those community voices to rise and to, really give notion to their own strengths, right? To say their strengths, to say their affirm what, is positive and what looks good as a family to them, like what a family unit looks like to them, what a good family looks like to them, not our notion of what a good family is, right? What a safe family is. And then to allow room to rebuild all of that disintegration that we put in place over the past hundreds of years, right? To allow these families to rebuild themselves. And in places where that rebuilding is impossible, right? To reimagine what support looks like for those families, right? What does support look like for families who are in need of help, who are in need of assistance, right? Is that mandated programming or is that some other sort of community support? And I think once we allow ourselves to be comfortable with recognizing that we don't know everything about what these families need, then we can possibly come to a space where we're saying, okay, we need to hear from you. And I think that's what we need to do to be able to reimagine what this system looks like.
Another thing to go along with that is that our social services system is piecemeal. So we say, oh, you don't have enough food, we'll give you food stamps. Oh, you don't have a good place to live, we'll give you a housing voucher. We have little pieces. So we say, okay, we'll give you this piece or we'll give you this piece. We don't have a holistic system that says, oh, you don't have enough income to raise your family. And, that goes back to sort of systematic dismantling of our economic structure so that families can't, at a basic level, can't earn enough to support their families. That is something that started happening in the last century and has continued today. But there have been a number of studies that have shown that what's called, and I'm going to get into politics here, what's called universal basic income, which is basically where you say, okay, here's how much money a family needs in this community just to meet its basic needs, and we're just going to give you that much money. We're not going to give you food stamps. We're not going to give you housing assistance. We're not going to give you this, that, and the other thing where you have to go to this social worker for this and that social worker for this other thing. And you have to show this card for that and this other card for the other thing. We're just going to say, here's the basic amount of money you need to raise your family. And then we're going to leave you alone and let you raise your family. And in places where that's been tried, it has worked. And child abuse and neglect have gone down because one thing, the neglect is gone because now the children have a good place to live and they have enough food and they have clean clothes and they have shoes that fit. but also the enormous stressors that we put on families when we make them work 3 jobs that are at minimum wage just so that they don't get their light bill turned off. Those enormous stressors, I mean, as a parent, I had moments when I was stressed out, and I tell people this all the time. I used to go in my bedroom, I would shut the door, and I would jump up and down and scream because I didn't want to yell at my child. When the stress got so high that my child would come to me and I would just be like, I can't take another minute of this. I knew that I could do that. I could be, abusive to my child. I shut the door and I would just jump up and down and scream. That is the stress that a single parent, and I was a single parent, sometimes has to deal with. When we make it so that a single parent home or a 2-parent home that is struggling to make ends meet doesn't have that stress, we're going to see those incidents go down. So it's not even just fixing a family, it's just giving the family what they need. And the system that we have now basically makes people come to the government with their handout saying, please, sir, can I have some more food stamps? Please, sir, can I have, some money to turn my light bill back on? Please, sir, my phone, I can't call anyone because my phone bill got turned off. That's the humiliation that we're subjecting families to through that system is really terrible. And we need to be empowering families to have what they need. We talk about the cycle of poverty partly because we believe as a society, and I'm not saying we individually necessarily hold these beliefs, that we believe that we make enough money because we're good people who deserve that amount of money, and that poor people somehow are too lazy or too dumb or just not deserving enough to actually, lift themselves up by their bootstraps, which of course is physically impossible. And so those belief systems that our society has developed keep us trapped in these systems. We would save so much money as a government if we didn't have to have so many, welfare workers, because we basically just gave families what they need instead of making them spend hours in a welfare office to wait to see if they qualify for food stamps after they fill out 101 forms. And now I'll get off my soapbox.
So I think that reimagining child welfare is it feels like a complex question. And I think that I want to be completely honest, because I think it's important for folks who are watching who maybe do my work in other states or do this work in some kind of setting to know that I honestly didn't get to this place for a while. I'll be honest that I kind of had a bit of a breakdown when so many unarmed Black men were being killed. And I started to question to myself, and what I'm doing to reform the foster care system really making a difference? Am I getting at some of the true causes of why children are entering care? Am I addressing racism in child welfare? And I couldn't really answer that question fully. And I think part of why I couldn't answer it is because and a lot of us who do this work, we tend to do what our state is ready to do, right? It took us years to get to a place where we could openly talk about kinship care. We could actively talk about putting investments for families. And we like our process of doing that was like, we got to educate and build will. And some of that's still true. But at what point do we have to ask ourselves, when do we have to just do what's best for kids and families? And I think that honestly, that's what this question is really about, around reimagining the child welfare system. So to me, it is from this point on, focusing on the most pressing issues within child welfare that is intertwined in all of it, which is racism, that are leading to our outcomes. And I think that every single thing that we do has to connect to those issues. In some regards, that may mean completely doing things differently than what we do now. I also know how government works and how legislation works, and I also know that that takes time and process, but I actually think that's okay, because I don't think it took us 400 years to get to this kind of child welfare system. I don't unrealistically think that we should throw it out the door tomorrow and rebuild, because we're probably going to make a lot of mistakes. What I'm saying is, instead, we can't continue to put Band-Aids on issues that are so much deeper than the little wounds that we are seeing. And I think that's going to take a little bit more courage from all of us on this call, but all of us listening. It's going to take more courage if you are a foster parent. You might find yourself as a foster parent. I know a lot of you are foster parents who are watching this and commenting. What that might look like for you is being a little bit more courageous when you're talking to maybe your local worker and saying, like, did you do everything you could for this family? This mom is trying really, really hard, and I don't see it being responded to well. She told me that she had to take the bus for 3 hours to come and visit. Like, it's unacceptable. What else can we do? Like, we have Uber. Like, what can, asking some of those questions that might seem so basic, but are parts of how we're going to dismantle racism within our child welfare sector. And I know we did not get to every single question that was in the chat box, but we're going to continue even after this to write in responses. I do have a question for those of you who are watching. If you would like us to, it feels like we didn't get to say everything we wanted to say because we're coming right up at an hour. If you think that it would be worthwhile to do a part 2, put that in the comments, like, yes, I want a part 2. We don't want to do it if people don't think there is a need for it. So please let us know. Let us know how you feel about that last question. It is heavy. It took such a long time to really be able to have these conversations. And we're taking a risk, honestly, just putting our thoughts out there into the world for you all to hear and listen. But I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's what the next step looks like for us. I know at Voices, we are committed to continuing to serve and give voice to children and families, and really taking ourselves out of the equation at times and saying we have to listen to families and we have to listen to youth on how we change the system. So let us know how you liked this talk in the comments section, and it will be available immediately upon when we end this, so you'll be able to send it to other folks who missed it. I will also throw up our contact information. So if you have follow-up questions that you can email us, please be patient. We all are living in a different time. And I know I have a almost 2.5-year-old. And so pretty much as soon as this is over, he'll probably be needing me for something. So please be patient. And really, really thank you for your time. Thank you, Valerie and Fallon, for all of your knowledge and wisdom and everything that you shared today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And is it okay for me to make a quick shameless plug? And so, yes, I am the director of the Family Law Clinic here in Richmond, Virginia. We represent parents who are accused of abuse and neglect in family court. And so if you are watching this and you know parents who could benefit from our services, we try to provide a holistic defense model of representation, making sure that we're considering the whole family as a unit and working to get better outcomes for children and for parents who are involved in the system. If you know families who are involved who could benefit from our services or some advice or consultation, please make sure you refer them to us, and Allison's going to provide our contact information.
Yes. All right. Thank you.